One thing that's important I wanted to share at some point during this series, and today's a good day to do it, that as a church, the vision of our church, as you've read before and heard me state before, is that we're following Jesus together. And so we've learned over the course of our time together how best to read the Bible. We've looked at the Old Testament quite a bit, and we've shared about how Jesus has to be our tour guide, our flashlight into the Old Testament, that we can't fully understand it, fully capture what the purpose of it is without getting to Jesus. This is all throughout our Epiphany series this past year, finding Jesus in the Old Testament. To understand the Old Testament, we must take Jesus. Paul writes that if we don't take Jesus with us to help us interpret it, it's like reading it with a veil over our eyes. We can't fully understand it. And so on the journey of the people of God, they don't quite have God figured out until they get to Jesus. Well, the same is true for the rest of the Bible. The same is true for the Apostle Paul, the book of Revelation, the other writings in the New Testament. Many of us, perhaps you, grew up in the church, and Paul, the apostle, is who wrote and helped you learn many of your theological truths that you stand on. What does it mean to be a Christian? You might reference something from the book of Romans or Ephesians or Galatians. Paul writes very theologically, as we've already said before. But sometimes we want to take what Paul writes and then go find what Jesus says. And if there's tension there, which I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself, but I do believe certainly there's tension that we must work through. We don't go to the Apostle Paul and say, I need to figure out how to make Jesus' words match up. No, in fact, we do just like we do in the Old Testament. We start with Jesus. What is Jesus' life and ministry about? What do we learn about Jesus? And then we must take what the Apostle Paul writes and let that be, Jesus be the filter by which we understand Paul. Because Paul's life was changed by Jesus. Paul and Jesus aren't at odds. They don't differ. They don't go against one another. In fact, but to best understand Paul, we must begin with Jesus. And that helps give and bring light to the many writings and letters that Paul writes. But if we just go to Paul, sometimes we miss out on context of him writing to Gentiles from a prison, of him writing to this, what's going on, and it's hard for us to understand, so we must begin with Jesus. So let's remember that as we continue through this series. We're in the book of Colossians today, which again we've been in before, where Paul challenged them that they would remain faithful to Jesus, that they would not compromise, that they wouldn't have a statue to Zeus and Roma and Jesus, but that they would see that Jesus is far above all of these, even far above Caesar. This is why in Colossians 1, that great poem that Paul writes, where it says Jesus has created all and everything through him, and he is above all things. This great poem that we read in Colossians 1. This is that same letter. So we're jumping down to Colossians chapter 3. Now today we're mainly looking at one main section from 1 through 17, but 12 through 17 is where we'll really dive in. Paul writes this, and you won't see this on the screen, but in verse 1 he says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God." He's writing to the church, reminding them, if you are following Jesus, if you have been raised by Jesus, think of the things above. Think on things the way Jesus would. Let's not forget Jesus is the head of the church. Jesus is our leader. Jesus is whom we follow. Jesus is Lord. And so then Paul lists several things. He has two sections, one of which that says, here's what you don't need to do. Here's what you need to, as he writes, put to death. Here's what you need to stay away from. And then he has another paragraph that we'll look at more closely today. Here's what you do need to do. Here's the things you need to, as he writes, put on. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But Paul writes this in verse number 5. This one will be on the screen. Paul says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you? Sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness," which is idolatry. Paul's starting off strong, saying, put these things to death. Put these things away. You do not need things, and he gives a list. All right, impurity, sexual immorality, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. All of these things Paul lists here, these sins, if you really think about them, are sins against our own body. Sins that we commit against ourselves, and therefore, as he writes down, he says, which these are idolatry. So what is idolatry? That's a Christian-y word, a Bible word. What does that word mean, idolatry? It's to place something above God. That's the simple definition, to place something above God. And so for these Colossians, they were certainly struggling with placing Zeus or Roma or these other gods and goddesses or Caesar above God. For us, it looks different. We place different things above God. Sometimes it's our time, our money, our relationships, power, right? This kind of pursuits we can place above God. And this is what idolatry is. At the end of the day, it's not about the thing that we place above God. Rather, it's our heart behind it, because inevitably what that means is that we place ourselves above God. That at the end of the day, it's about what we want, what our desires are. We determine what's right and wrong, good and evil, and we put God and we demote him, and we place ourselves above. That's why he lists out these things that are all sins: sexual immorality, impurity, passions. All these things are sins that we commit ourselves from within ourselves. Even covetousness, right? This comes from Exodus 20. This is the 10th commandment. Do not covet. And it's again saying essentially, God, I don't quite trust that you know what's best. So I think I know what's best, and I need that person's stuff over there. I'm coveting their things, therefore I'm not satisfied in myself, trusting you that you are the provider. And then Paul lists another section in verse 8. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk. Verse 9, he goes on to say lying. These are things Paul lists to stay away from. And this is how we treat other people. Angry with them, having malice towards them, obscene talk, lying to them. These are things Paul writes to stay away from as well if we are to represent God. And these are the things, if you look at them, it's how we treat other people. And so I love how this comes all the way back together. Jesus was asked one time, what is the greatest commandment? And of course, he didn't give one, he gave two. He said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. These two, Jesus says, sum up all of the law and all of the prophets, all of the Old Testament. If we can just love God with all of our heart, soul, and strength, and if we can just love our neighbors as ourselves. And Paul, when he writes these two lists in verse 5 and verse 8, is saying, hey, the first list is when we don't love God right, we put ourselves above God. The second list is when we don't love our neighbor right. So it comes back together. If we can just love God with all of our heart and love our neighbor as ourselves, it helps us keep away from these things. Put to death all of these things listed out and follow Jesus instead. These are the things we must flee from, we must stay away from. Placing ourselves above God and our own passions and the ways that we treat other people that are not loving, that are not just. Those are the things that God cares about. Paul goes on to write this in verse number 12. And this will be our primary passage today. I want to read it all the way through, and then we'll go back through and see what God has to say. Verse number 12. Paul writes, put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Verse 17, and whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. As always, Paul's words are so beautiful. As he writes these things, this is what it means to follow Jesus as he challenges this church in Colossae. And so how does he begin? I want us to start at the very beginning. It says to put on, but he identifies the people as God's chosen ones. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. I don't want us to miss the importance, the significance of this line. You see, for so long, all throughout the Old Testament, you had the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews were God's chosen ones. This was God's family. This was the family that God had a relationship with, that he made a covenant with from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the way back in Genesis. The Jews were God's chosen people. The Gentiles were not. The Gentiles were left out. The Gentiles were not part of the family. They were on the outside looking in. They did not have a relationship with God. They did not have a covenant with God. The Gentiles were not chosen ones. And Paul here, as a Jewish man, a missionary to the Gentiles, says something and writes this which is quite significant. Saying, you Gentiles that were once out, you in fact are God's chosen ones. No longer is it just about ethnicity with the Jewish people. It's now open to all people. Who are the chosen ones now, as Paul writes? It's those that follow Jesus. This was the beginning of our paragraph all the way back in verse 1. The saints that are following Christ, that have been raised with Jesus, you are God's chosen ones. So it's not Jew and Gentile anymore, but rather now it's those following Jesus, the church, which means that's you and that's me. The church, we as the church are God's chosen ones. So what does it mean to be chosen? What are we chosen for? What are we chosen to do? Sometimes we like to overcomplicate things. Our task as the church is that we would represent God to the world. We want to overcomplicate it, but we don't need to. Our job is that we represent God to the world. All of the grace and mercy, the goodness of God, His love for us, our task is that we would receive it and that we would reflect it to the world around us. That we as God's image bearers would reflect God to the world. That when they see us, they see a glimpse at least of who God is. This is our task, and this is what Paul's going to go into right in a minute. All of these qualities, right, these attributes that help us reflect God. This is what Paul's writing about. As God's chosen ones, you and I, the church now, are chosen to represent God to the world so that when the world looks in, they see a glimpse of God. Paul opens it up by saying, put on. Put on then. Paul uses this analogy a few times later on in Ephesians. He'll write about putting on the full armor of God. Maybe a passage you've heard before. The breastplate and the belt, right? The sandals, the helmet. To put on, and there's this understanding, this connotation with put on is that there's a choice. Something we must decide to do, that we would put something on. And Paul says, put on these qualities and attributes. Again, we're going to read through those in a moment. You know, when I get up in the morning, I make a decision of what I'm going to put on. We all do. Some of us put more time into it than others, and that's okay. People put plenty more time into it than I do. But what we put on is essentially saying this: here's how I'm going to represent myself to the world today. What I'm putting on is how the world is going to see me. So whether I'm wearing a suit and a tie, if I'm wearing shorts and flip-flops and a t-shirt, whether I have no shirt on, which is nothing nobody wants to see, whatever it is, whatever I put on is how I represent myself to the world. And in the same way, Paul says, for these qualities, each day you wake up, and you might need to put on a fresh, compassionate heart. Put on kindness. Right? Put on humility and meekness. We're going to read this through in a minute. These are the things that we put on so that we can represent God. So that we can be an image, a picture of God, because we've put these things on. Again, I've said before, God cares much less about what we actually wear to church or what we wear on our outside of our bodies. He cares about what's on the inside. And this is where Paul says to put these things on so that you can properly witness, so that you can properly love, so that you can properly represent God to the world around you, which again is our God-given task as God's chosen ones. Holy and beloved. Holy meaning set apart. Beloved meaning part of the family. We're set apart that we might represent God to the world. And if we miss this calling, if we misunderstand this opportunity to put these things on, to make this choice each day to say, I want to represent God, so I need to put on these attributes, then we're missing out on our God-given calling of what our task is to be as we walk about this earth. As we interact with the people in our workplace and in our neighborhoods, down the streets, our family and friends, this is what we're tasked to do. And so what does it look like? What does Paul write? Compassionate hearts. Kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Let's read it again. Compassionate hearts. This is what we are to put on. Compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Do you feel as though these qualities are indicative of our culture today? Do these attributes reflect our culture and society today? What do you think? I feel as though they do not. But more importantly, I almost feel as though they don't represent our church either. The church doesn't seem to look like this either. If you asked anyone around and said, hey, give the top 5 attributes of the church. Give some attributes describing the church. Is this the list that they come up with? Do they say, oh yeah, the church, they're compassionate, man, they're humble, they're patient? Or do they say, no, the church is judgmental, the church is even hateful, The church always has to be right. The church is ready to argue and fight against you. What is the way the world sees the church? Because Paul is writing here that our task is to represent Jesus, is to represent God by putting on these attributes. Compassionate hearts. You know, there's something that's been going on the last few weeks, maybe you're aware of, called student loan forgiveness. Oh boy. Student loan debt. And maybe you've been under a rock and you don't know what I'm talking about, but President Biden and others have announced that this is the plan to forgive student loan debt. Now, there's people that are in this room, I know, even in our small church, that are on way one side of the debate and way on the other side of the debate. Now, I'm not here as your pastor to tell you which side of the debate you need to be on, to tell you what you need to think or how you need to think economically. I've heard good reasons of economics and equity on one side and good reasons of economics and equity on the other side. Well, it's not forgiveness, it's transference, and this taxes are going to go up, but this person's going to be freed from this debt, and I've seen all sorts of arguments, and I'm not here to tell you which argument you need to jump into. But what has saddened me the most over these last few weeks in this whole debate is the Christians that I know that I've seen that have responded by saying, well, I had to pay my loans. Well, I had to pay off my debt, so they got to pay off theirs. Hey, they knew what they were doing. They take out a loan, they got to pay it back. I did it, they got to do it. And this response does not come with a compassionate heart. I don't care what you think economically or what the solution is. I'm not asking you that, and you can have your opinion there. But as a Christ follower, if we're to represent Jesus to the world, when someone is struggling or in debt or struggling to get out, they're drowning, might we respond with compassion? Or do we respond with what? Sucks for them. This is what I've seen so often, and it's not the heart of God to respond this way. Can we have compassion? Can we see them in their plight and have compassion as Jesus has for us? This is how we represent God to the world. Not by saying, sucks for you, too bad for you, I had to do it. I paid off all my student loan debt, it doesn't affect me as much. But can we have compassion when someone is struggling? Or do we feel like, oh, I had to do it, I had to deal with it, I had to suffer through it, so do they. One represents God and one doesn't. I pray we would be a people that choose to represent God by having compassionate hearts. Something we probably have to remind ourselves to put on every day because we forget, because we get jaded and judgmental. Can we have compassion? Kindness, humility, meekness, patience. All of these qualities are so important as we seek to represent God to the world, that we might respond in these ways. When life doesn't come at us as we thought, when someone is conflicting, when someone is on the different team, a different side, a different political side. I talk about politics in here some, and I hate on cable news a lot. You know that if you've been here. The other day I was in Planet Fitness, as I go to occasionally, and I wasn't lifting weights, but I was on the treadmill. So, doing my walking, and they got the 50 TVs, way out here. And as I'm walking, I can't help but notice on one TV we got CNN. One TV over here, we got Fox News. Of course, this represents either side, the right and the left. Now, I can't hear what's being said, but what I can see is the bottom line. The bold black print that's at the bottom, that's what they're talking about. And if you can be so surprised, on CNN, the bottom line was making fun, was picking at Donald Trump and the scandal that's currently going on. When I watched the Fox News, the bottom line was certainly making fun and demeaning and picking at Joe Biden, some of his policies and decisions. And every time I ever see these two things, here's what's going on. There's a back and a forth. And for us as Christ followers, when we're not careful, we get sucked into our political ideologies that more represent us than perhaps these characters. I've seen people many times that say, hey, how can you be for that candidate that did this or said this? Or how can you do for this side who thinks this or does this? And almost 99%, almost 100% of the time, the response, you know what the response is? Well, your guy did this. Oh, well, your side did that. And there's a back and a forth, and the issue's not even discussed. It says, how do you be for this guy who said this? And it's like, well, who cares? How can you be for this guy that says this? And it's back and it's forth, and we're always having to be right. And what's happened is that as the church, as us who seek to follow Jesus, as we get more and more and more defined by our political ideologies, that culture seeps into who we are, where we have to be right, where we have to be on top, where we have to be the best. And when those mentalities are in the forefront, it's hard to be humble. It's hard to be meek. And yet Paul writes to this church in Colossae that's dealing with a lot of the same things. They didn't have Republicans and Democrats, but they had their own political systems. They had their own ideologies. They had their own Caesar worship. And he says, if you want to follow Jesus and represent him to the outside world, you're going to have to be humble. You're going to have to be meek. You're going to have to lower yourselves and even serve one another and engage with people that are different, that disagree, that aren't on your same team or think the same ways. You can't just huddle together with them and spend time. No, you have to look outside of your own circle and live with humility, with patience. What if we had patience with one another? Or are we so quick to judge and say, oh, they're that side, or they're that political color, and so they're forgotten. They're dismissed. They're disregarded. All of these qualities, we could have a whole series on these, but this is how we are to represent God, which is our task as God's chosen ones, that we would put these on to represent God to the world, that when they look in, they see compassionate hearts, not judgmentalness. They see humility, not aloofness, not having to always be right and talking down and demeaning one another, but they see compassion and kindness. They see humility and meekness, and they see patience. Paul goes on to write that they bear with one another. Have you ever had to bear with someone? Paul had a good word here, bear. To bear with someone. When someone's like, hey, can you bear with me? It means that you're not quite getting along. They're not quite doing what you hoped they would. And they're like, hey, bear with me. It's a way of saying have patience with me. But to bear with someone, as Paul writes, is what we call life together in relationship. You know, the people that I have to bear with are the people that are in my life, right? That's who we have to bear with. This is why it's so important for us to live life in relationship. It's why small groups are so important for our church. Coming together on Sunday is wonderful, and I love it every week, and I pray that we learn new things and are challenged. But this plays out when we leave this place. And the time we come together for our small groups in homes and in restaurants is where we can ask questions and challenge one another and pray with one another and bear with one another. When people let us down, when people make wrong decisions and dumb decisions, that we bear with them. To bear with someone is to give someone a second chance, a third chance, a 10th chance. In fact, what better way can we represent God to the world than by bearing with people? Because you know what God has done for us? The same thing. I think about God bearing with me and all the stupid decisions I've made. I've shared this before. It's been a little while, but most of you have heard some of my story. When I first went to college as a young man in 2003, I was not ready, and I failed out. Went to school, and I skipped class, and I skipped class, and I skipped class one too many times, and in fact led to me coming home and pulling up my grades and having all Fs. I failed out. It led me to move home. I had to move home in great shame. Like no one wants to move home after they just got out and go to college, and now I'm here moving home because I failed out of school. I'm living at home, and it started this cycle, this pattern in my life for about 3 years where I would go to school and then I'd drop out, or I'd get bad grades again and I'd quit again, or I'd work at this random odd job. I'd stay up too late and spend time with friends. I was spinning my wheels not doing anything. I was a complete loser, a bum. But I think about that time of the people in my life that bore with me. I've mentioned some of them before. There's a youth minister at the church in the city there named Seth that would bear with me. My girlfriend's dad, who would soon be my father-in-law, would bear with me when he should have been the first one to kick me to the curb. My girlfriend, who, thank the Lord she didn't break up with me, who's now my wife, would bear with me. giving me second chances, forgiving me, walking along with me, because this is life in a relationship where we bear with people. And it's throughout that time where I felt and experienced people having patience with me, having kindness with me, bearing with me, that has now led me to want to do the same thing. I want to bear with people. You know, because we all need it. We all need people to pick us up and carry us from time to time. We need people to encourage us and to remind us and to point us the right direction. We need people to bear with us, because sometimes we're a bear. Sometimes it's hard to get along with each of us. We all have our own personality quirks and weird habits that we have, certainly. Can we bear with people? When we do so, we represent God by having patience with them. Paul says to bear with one another. And then Paul says this, if someone has a complaint, if a complaint comes up against you, he says to forgive as Christ has forgiven you. Nowadays, how complaints mostly look like online nowadays, right? Most of us are a little too wimpy to actually fight and complain face to face, so we do that online. Back and forth, and there's accusations on message boards and Facebook comments, and this is where we go to complain, and certainly we've all experienced it. But can we be a people that when someone complains that we instead have compassion, that we instead forgive instead of trying to get even, trying to retaliate? You may not know this, but every Sunday evening into Monday morning, the church, we will post the sermon on Facebook. Post the link there and it comes up and it's for whoever to see. And pretty much every single week, someone hops on there and complains. Gives a bad comment. Why is this here? I don't want to see this. Someone made fun of my pants even last week, if you went and saw that. People complain often, and they're going to. But you know what? I love, Jess will tell you this, I love when those people do that. I love getting to engage with them. I love responding back in kindness. I love trying to interact with them. And in fact, there's several that at once responded with hate to a message or a sermon or a podcast there that's sitting online, that they now interact with me regularly, that we now talk often. Because we engage with them. Because I get to reach out and say, hey, tell me about your life. What's going on? Why do you have this bad experience with church? What happened to you? We all have these experiences, right? And Paul knows this, and he says, when people have complaints against you, we can either shun them and push them away, or we can forgive. And if we want to represent God to the world, we are to forgive. So when someone writes a negative comment, it doesn't make me mad at all. In fact, it reminds me of why we moved here to plant a church. And I want to forgive and then help restore and help answer questions and point in the right direction and be a kind face to them. You might start looking online now and trying to find these bad comments. They're all there. And I don't need you to hop on and be negative instead of me. Respond with kindness. This is how I want our church to be as we represent God. Kindness, forgiveness, all of these things are what we receive from God, which is again our God-given task that we then reflect those to the world. Paul sums it up, a lot of this, by saying, above all, we said a lot of things, but above all those, put on love. He says, which binds together everything in perfect harmony. Put on love above all. It binds everything together. We can't do any of these things. We cannot have compassion. We cannot forgive. We can't be kind if we do not love. It's all the way back to what Jesus says. How do we follow all of these things? How do we follow and fulfill all of the Old Testament? That we love God and that we love our neighbor. That we love God with all of our heart, that we love our neighbors as ourselves. Love binds all of these together. Love brings all of this together. If we don't start and have love, all of these other things can fade away. Only because of our love that we can have that comes from God. It's not from within ourselves. God gives us love, and again, as we reflect that, it plays out in these ways. It also tells me that all of these attributes are components of love. What does love look like? It looks like compassion. It looks like forgiveness. Love looks like humility and meekness. Love looks like patience. Paul writes this in other places, but he's reminding us, if we are to love one another, it's going to look like this. It's not on our own agenda. It's not our own way, own thing to define. No, love is listed out here. Here's the attributes that look like love. And love, when we put it on, it binds and holds all of these things together. We should be a people that pray daily for love. God, give me a love that I can love the people that I don't agree with. That I can love the people that I don't like. That I can love the people on the other side of the aisle, on the other side of the spectrum that disagree with all of my thoughts. Lord, allow me to have love so great that it can even be for them. This is how we begin to display God to the world around us. Love. And he says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. The peace of Christ rules in our hearts when we have love and have these attributes. When we're able to have compassion and forgive people, then the peace of Christ can rule in our hearts, and we're not always agitated. We're not always angry. How many Christians do you know that are always upset and angry and mad about something? I know quite a bit. I know quite a few. We always want to yell at somebody and defend ourselves and point fingers, and we're always mad and angry and agitated. And in doing so, the peace of Christ is not present in our hearts. We should be settled. The peace of Christ is in our hearts, and it allows us to then love, to have compassion, to consider ourselves less than, to be humble. This is the peace of Christ. It surpasses, Paul writes in other places, that surpasses all understanding. We can't comprehend it, but it's God's peace within us that allows us to represent Him to the world. He closes and says a few important things. He says singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. I love that today we did exactly all that at the church. John read Psalm 1. Now, of course, it says singing psalms. John, do you want to come back down and sing that? We read it. Reading it will do just fine. Singing psalms, which is what they would do. They would chant them. They would rock back and forth with their whole body and chant these psalms. This was their prayer book and their song book. The Jewish people would do this. Hymns, which we sang. Spiritual songs. This is what we do every Sunday. This is the important part of following Jesus, that we are spiritually formed. This is why coming to church is so important. When we get out of this place, it's easy to get sucked into other ways of thinking, other ideologies. We forget to put on kindness and compassion. We forget that we're representing God and that's our task, and we're ready to go fight against the world instead. When we come back to church, hopefully it's a reminder. It helps form us as we sing. The words that we sing are so important. I pray that when it's time to worship, you wouldn't just be scrolling your phone ready to get to the next thing, but that you would engage, that you would sing, that you would humble yourself, maybe even lifting your hands to say, I believe these words that I'm singing. I surrender myself. I don't want to be idolatrous and put me above God. Lord, I want to put you above. I want to lift you high. This is why it's important as we come together, singing these psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And Paul writes this to close. Paul says, whatever you do, whether word or deed, do it in the name of Jesus, giving thanks to God. Maybe you've heard this verse before and you've skimmed right over it, but in fact it's quite important how Paul writes this, because he addresses something very present in the situation. He says, whatever you do, whether a word or a deed. Well, here's what we know about cultures. The Jewish culture was all about what you do. You are known for what you do. This is the Jewish culture, the Jewish way of life. You are known for what you do. Well, the Roman culture, which is borrowed from the Greek culture, right, this Enlightenment culture, they're more known for what they say. Therefore, what they think. It's two extremely different cultures. One known for what you do and one known for what you say, therefore what you think. This Enlightenment understanding culture versus this utilitarian working, doing culture. And so Jew and Gentile. So what Paul is really saying here, whenever you do, whether word or in deed, he's reminding them once again, whether Jew or Gentile, whether you grew up understanding the law and the Torah and the Old Testament and the prophets, or whether you grew up with Zeus and Roma and Dionysus and Caesar, whatever your culture is, whatever you do, whatever you say, all things, our task as the church now unified together is that we would represent God, is that we would live a life that looks like Jesus. This is our God-given task. This is what we're called to do. And this is why Paul writes to the church in Colossae, and it's Paul writing the same thing to us, the church in America, that we would put on. Church, every morning, let's wake up and think and consider that we might put on these attributes. Say, God, allow me to have an opportunity today that I might represent you to the world around me. Not by having to be right, not by proving someone wrong, not by accusing someone, not by being judgmental, but by putting on these, putting on a compassionate heart. That when we see someone struggling, we don't think, too bad. But that we think, man, how can I help? What can I do? I feel for you. This is how Jesus looks at us. He feels for us in our condition, in our sinful state. Might we have the same heart of Christ? That is our task. Not to fight against the world, but to reach the world by putting on these attributes that Paul lists. Let's pray together.